The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden glow across the neighborhood. The air was cool, with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves of the trees lining the streets. It was early, and the world seemed still, with only a few cars passing by as the streets lay quiet. For most people, it was just another peaceful morning, but for him it was a moment of calm in a life that had been anything but. He was walking at a steady pace, his dog by his side. The dog, a large breed with a sleek coat, was a constant companion. For years, this dog had been with him, through thick and thin, offering comfort and loyalty in ways that few humans could. The man had once been a part of a world filled with danger, missions that took him to the most remote corners of the globe, dealing with situations that most people could never imagine. But now he was just another face in the crowd, enjoying the simple pleasure of a morning walk with his dog. This was his life now. Gone were the days of covert operations, briefings in dimly lit rooms, and high-stakes encounters that could change the course of history. Now he had chosen a quieter existence away from the chaos of his past. He had moved into a small house on a quiet street, far from the military bases and the constant threat of danger. He had put his skills to rest, hoping that the peace of his new life would help him find some semblance of normalcy. As he walked, the dog stayed close, its tail wagging gently as they moved along the familiar route. There was something comforting about the rhythm of their steps, the way they both knew this walk so well. It was the kind of routine that brought him peace, a reminder of simpler times before the weight of his past had followed him into this quiet suburban life. But as they rounded the corner, something in the air changed. The man could sense it, a subtle shift that made him pause. His dog, sensing it too, stiffened. It was a small change, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to the man it was an alarm bell. His hand instinctively went to the side, as if reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. The tools of his former life, now long put away. He knew that when you've lived through enough, your senses never quite let you go. Something wasn't right. Up ahead, a car rolled to a stop. The man could hear the faint sound of voices, but it wasn't the usual morning hum of the neighborhood. No, this was different. It wasn't until he got closer that he saw them. 2 police officers standing by their squad car looking his way. He didn't recognize them, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that his dog was now alert, its body tense, its ears perked. It didn't take long for the man to realize what was happening. The officers were watching them closely, their eyes scanning the man and the dog. To anyone who didn't know, it might have seemed like just another routine interaction, but the man knew better. The dog was on edge, and that meant something was off. His dog had always been protective, especially around strangers. If the officers were going to approach, it was likely that the dog would react defensively. He moved quickly, giving the dog a command to stay calm, but the situation escalated faster than he anticipated. One of the officers took a step forward, his hand moving towards his weapon. The man's heart skipped a beat. In that moment, he knew what was happening. His dog was reacting, and the officer, uncertain and probably feeling threatened, was ready to act. The man shouted a warning, trying to diffuse the tension, but the officers weren't listening. They were too focused on the dog. The man tried again, raising his voice, but it wasn't enough. The dog had begun to growl now, its teeth showing, a clear sign of warning. The officer hesitated, looking from the dog to the man. Then in a split second, everything changed. The officer's hand shot up, and before the man could react, a shot rang out. The sound echoed through the street, deafening in its suddenness. The dog yelped, its body jerking, and then collapsed onto the ground. The man froze, unable to process what had just happened. He rushed to the dog's side, falling to his knees in the street. His heart pounded in his chest as he knelt over his dog, feeling for a pulse that wasn't there. The dog's body was still warm, but it wasn't moving. The man's hands shook as he checked again, hoping against all odds that he was wrong, that the dog had just been stunned. But it was no use. His dog was dead. In an instant, everything he had known about safety, peace, and routine was shattered. The officers, now realizing the gravity of what they had done, stood in silence. One of them stepped forward, his face filled with regret, but the damage was done. There was no going back. The man stood, his fists clenched at his sides, his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but something held him back. His dog was gone. The one constant in his life, the one being who had been there through everything, was dead. The officers apologized, their voices full of regret, but it didn't matter. Their words were hollow. They hadn't known who he was. They hadn't understood the full scope of what had just happened. If they had known, would they have acted differently? Would they have hesitated before pulling the trigger? He didn't know, and the thought made him sick. The man turned to look at them, his voice steady but filled with anger. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his words cold and hard. The officers didn't respond. They stood there, unsure of how to make things right. The man's mind raced, trying to find some way to process what had just happened. But the grief was overwhelming. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't supposed to be how his day ended. This wasn't supposed to be how his life went from peaceful to tragic. As the man stood over his dog, the reality of the situation began to sink in. He had always known that life could change in an instant. He had seen it too many times in the past. One wrong move, one split-second decision, and everything could be lost. But this was different. This wasn't a foreign battlefield. This wasn't an enemy soldier. This was a mistake made by people who didn't know any better. People who didn't realize who he was. He wasn't just some random guy in the neighborhood. He wasn't just a man walking his dog. He had once been a part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous, and yet none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that his dog was gone. And the silence that followed was deafening. The officers seemed to understand the weight of their mistake, but it was too late. Nothing they said could bring the dog back. The man took one last look at the lifeless body of his companion before turning away. His heart was heavy, but there was something else building inside him. A need for justice. A desire to make sure that what had just happened wouldn't be forgotten. He couldn't let it go. Not like this. As he walked away, leaving the officers behind, the weight of the loss stayed with him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. This wouldn't end here. The morning air had lost its warmth. The sun, which had once bathed the streets in light, now felt distant and cold. He walked away from the scene, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and pain. The officers were still standing there, no doubt trying to figure out how to make things right, but it didn't matter. Nothing could fix what had just happened. He didn't know where he was walking. His feet carried him aimlessly through the neighborhood, each step heavy with grief. The loss of his dog felt like a wound that wouldn't heal, an ache that cut deeper with every passing second. His mind kept returning to the image of his dog, lying on the pavement, its life stolen in an instant. He hadn't even had a chance to process it all. One moment they were just two friends enjoying the morning, and the next his dog was gone, and he was left standing there alone. But there was more to it than just grief. There was a growing sense of injustice in his chest, a burning need for answers. He had lived through countless dangerous situations, been trained to handle the most extreme environments, but nothing had prepared him for this. This wasn't the result of a battle fought on a distant battlefield. This wasn't a mission gone wrong. This was a mistake, a tragic, avoidable mistake made by people who didn't even know who he was. As he walked, he thought about the past, his time in the service, the countless missions, the risks, the sacrifices. He had faced some of the world's most dangerous situations, fought battles that no one would ever know about. He had been a part of a team that had done things most people could only imagine, and yet here he was in a suburban neighborhood, dealing with the fallout of a simple misunderstanding. It didn't make sense. His mind raced, and then, as if guided by instinct, he turned down a side street, away from the officers, away from the quiet neighborhood that had once felt like home. He needed to get away. He needed to think. He needed to be alone. He found himself at a park, a quiet spot he had often visited during his moments of solitude. It was empty now, save for a few birds perched on the nearby trees. The man sat down on a bench, his hands resting on his knees, and looked out at the open space before him. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the images of what had happened just hours earlier. But they kept coming back, relentless. The sound of the gunshot, the sight of his dog crumpling to the ground, the officers' faces full of confusion and regret, but no real understanding of the gravity of their actions. It wasn't just about the dog. It wasn't just about the loss of a companion. It was about respect. It was about how easily people could make snap judgments without truly understanding who they were dealing with. He wasn't just a man walking his dog. He wasn't just some random guy in the neighborhood. But to them, that's all he had been. Just another person, just another dog, and when things went wrong, they didn't hesitate. They acted on instinct. not realizing who they were dealing with. The man's thoughts shifted to his time in the service. He had been part of something much bigger than himself, trained to handle the most difficult situations with precision and care. He had learned to read people, to anticipate their actions before they even made them. He had spent years honing skills that were designed for one purpose: to keep others safe. He had put his life on the line for the greater good, protecting the innocent, taking on missions that no one else could. But now it seemed like all of that had been forgotten. Here in this moment, none of that mattered. The officers didn't know who he was. They didn't know the history he carried with him, the things he had done, the sacrifices he had made. They only saw a man and his dog. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. The dog had been his companion, his partner, his friend. They had been through so much together. When he had left the service, the dog had been there to help him adjust, to help him find peace in a world that had become foreign to him. The dog had been his anchor, the one constant in a life that had been anything but stable. And now it was gone. The anger inside him grew, burning hotter with each passing thought. He stood up suddenly, his fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't walk away from this and pretend like everything was fine. The officers had made a mistake, yes, but they had also taken something from him. They had taken his dog and with it a part of himself, and he wasn't going to let that go unnoticed. He knew he had options. He could go to the police department and file a report. He could seek legal action. But he wasn't interested in just getting an apology. An apology wouldn't bring his dog back. An apology wouldn't make things right. He needed justice. He needed accountability. He needed people to understand the gravity of what had happened. The first step, he knew, was to get his story out there, to make sure people knew what had happened. The officers had acted without thinking, without understanding who they were dealing with, and that needed to be addressed. He had spent his life working in the shadows, protecting the country, but now it seemed like he was being forced to step into the light. It was a role he wasn't used to, but one he was going to have to embrace if he wanted to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. He left the park, walking with a new sense of purpose. His mind was clear now, focused. He would find a way to make them understand. He would make sure they knew the truth. But more than that, he would make sure that his dog's memory wasn't lost in the noise. His dog had been more than just an animal. It had been a part of him, a part of his journey, and it deserved to be remembered. Over the next few days, he began reaching out. He contacted the media, hoping to find someone who would listen, someone who would give him the platform to tell his story. He spoke with lawyers, seeking advice on how to proceed. He was determined to make sure that what had happened would not be swept under the rug. The officers had made a mistake, but it was a mistake with consequences, and he was going to hold them accountable. As the days passed, the story began to gain attention. People who had heard about what had happened reached out to offer their support. Some were outraged by the actions of the officers. Others were sympathetic to the man's loss, but no one, it seemed, was indifferent. The incident had sparked a conversation about accountability, about the consequences of decisions made in the heat of the moment. And the more the man spoke out, the more he realized that he wasn't just fighting for justice for his dog. He was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting for the right to be seen, to be understood, and to be respected. But even as the story gained traction, the man couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something more to be done. He wasn't just trying to win a battle. He was trying to reclaim something that had been lost, something that could never be replaced. The dog had been more than just a companion. It had been a part of him, a reminder of everything he had been through. And now, as he fought for justice, he carried that memory with him, knowing that no matter what happened, he would never forget the loyalty and the love that had been lost in an instant. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. At first, there was the numbness of disbelief. The man had spent most of his life in intense situations, dangerous missions, life or death decisions, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. Nothing had ever left him feeling so empty, so completely powerless. His dog's death weighed on him, and he could feel it in every part of his body. The absence was a constant ache, a hole that he couldn't seem to fill, no matter how much he tried to focus on something else. But as the days passed, something else began to take hold, a quiet, growing fire within him. The anger he had initially suppressed now bubbled to the surface, stronger and more relentless with each passing hour. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't pretend like everything was okay. It wasn't. He found himself returning to the scene again and again. The empty street where it had happened, the place where everything changed, became a focal point for his grief. Each time he stood there, he tried to make sense of it all. How had it come to this? Why had the officers acted so quickly without thinking, without knowing who he was? If only they had known, he thought. If only they had understood that he wasn't just some random person in the neighborhood. If only they had realized that his life was filled with a history that they could never have imagined. He could still hear the dog's yelp as it fell to the ground, and the sound of the gunshot was a ghost that wouldn't leave him. The officers' faces came back to him, their confusion, their hesitation, but it wasn't enough. They had taken something from him, something he could never get back. The idea of justice became his anchor, something to focus on, something to fight for. He knew that he couldn't undo what had been done, but he also knew that he wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug. The officers had made a mistake, and that mistake had cost him everything. They needed to be held accountable. He wasn't sure what that would look like yet, but he was going to make sure that the story didn't fade away, that his dog's life didn't just become a forgotten tragedy. It wasn't long before the media caught wind of the situation. The man had always preferred to stay out of the spotlight, to keep his past buried, but now he had no choice. He started receiving calls from journalists asking for interviews, wanting to hear his side of the story. Some wanted to know about the police officers. Others were simply interested in the emotional aspect of the situation. At first he hesitated, but he knew that this was the only way to make his voice heard, to make sure that people understood the gravity of what had happened. He agreed to one interview, sitting down with a reporter who had been covering similar stories. It wasn't easy to talk about it, to put his emotions into words, but it felt necessary. The man explained what had happened, how everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. He talked about his dog, about the bond they had shared. It was hard to keep his voice steady as he spoke, but he did his best. He owed it to his dog to make sure the story was told, to make sure that the world knew the truth. The interview aired on the local news, and it didn't take long for it to gain traction. People who had seen the story reached out to offer their support. Some were angry at the officers, others were just heartbroken over the loss of the dog. But what struck the man the most were the messages from other veterans, people who had served in the military and understood the kind of life he had lived. They understood the bond between a soldier and their dog, the way a dog could become a lifeline in a world filled with chaos and danger. As the days turned into weeks, the story began to spread beyond the local news. It caught the attention of larger media outlets, and soon, people from all over the country were discussing what had happened. There was an outpouring of support for the man, but there were also those who questioned whether the officers had acted in the right way. It became a heated debate, with some defending the police for acting out of fear and others condemning them for their quick reaction. The man, however, didn't want to focus on the public debate. He didn't want to get caught up in the opinions of people who didn't know him, didn't know what he had been through. He had one goal now, and that was to make sure that the officers involved understood the full weight of their actions. They needed to realize that this wasn't just about a dog. It wasn't about a mistake that could be brushed off. This was about respect, about understanding the person standing in front of you, about taking the time to think before making life-altering decisions. He began to consult with lawyers, discussing what steps he could take to hold the officers accountable. He wasn't interested in revenge. He didn't want to drag this out any longer than necessary, but he knew that there needed to be consequences. The legal process was slow, and the bureaucracy was frustrating, but he was determined to see it through. He wasn't going to let his dog's death be reduced to a mere incident, a footnote in a long list of similar tragedies. His dog deserved more than that. As time went on, the man's grief began to evolve into something else, a quiet, determined strength. He no longer felt as if he were being swept along by the current of events. He was taking control. He had always been a man of action, and now that drive was focused on a new goal, justice. He would make sure that what happened to him, what happened to his dog, would be something people remembered. He would make sure that this wasn't just another sad story that faded away. The media attention grew, and soon the officers involved were forced to respond. They issued a statement, expressing their regret over the incident. They apologized for the loss, but they also defended their actions. They argued that they had been faced with a dangerous situation, that they had acted in the best interest of public safety. It was a standard response, one that didn't sit well with the man. He wasn't looking for an apology. He wasn't interested in excuses. He wanted accountability. The statements from the police only fueled his determination. He knew that their version of events couldn't be the final word. He had to make sure that people knew the truth. He wasn't trying to destroy anyone's career, but he was trying to make sure that something like this never happened again. He was fighting for his dog's memory, but he was also fighting for something bigger. He was fighting for the idea that every life mattered, every life deserved respect, and that no one should be judged based on assumptions. In the weeks that followed, the man continued his efforts to bring attention to the case. He spoke to more reporters, participated in interviews, and continued to consult with his legal team. He knew it was going to be a long road, but he was prepared to walk it. He wasn't going to back down. His dog's death had changed everything for him, and he wasn't going to let that change be for nothing. As the case began to gain more attention, it started to take on a life of its own. People from all walks of life reached out to show their support. Some offered financial help, others simply expressed their sympathy. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, and the man began to realize just how much his story had resonated with others. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever lost something precious. It was about the idea that our lives are all interconnected, that we all share the same basic need for respect and understanding. With every passing day, the man grew stronger. He was no longer just fighting for justice. He was fighting for something deeper, a sense of connection, a sense of humanity. And as the case moved forward, he knew that he was doing the right thing. He wasn't just honoring the memory of his dog. He was standing up for the kind of world he believed in, a world where people took the time to understand one another, where assumptions didn't lead to tragedy. The pressure was starting to build. The case was becoming more complex as the days went by, and though the man had found a renewed sense of purpose, the emotional toll of the situation began to take its own weight. The process of seeking justice wasn't as straightforward as he had hoped. It felt like every step forward was met with a step back, but he knew that he couldn't give up. He had started something, and there was no turning back now. The media attention had reached new heights. The story had become more than just a local issue. It had sparked a broader conversation about the way people were treated, the assumptions made about others, and the consequences of those assumptions. People from all over the country were reaching out to him, offering words of support and sharing their own stories of loss, of mistreatment, and of trying to stand up for what was right. He read many of those messages, but he couldn't help feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. While he appreciated the support, part of him felt conflicted. His dog had been his anchor, his source of peace in a life that had seen more than its fair share of turmoil. Now, it felt like his dog's memory was becoming part of something much larger, something that was out of his control. And though he didn't regret speaking out, a part of him still longed for the quiet days when it was just him and the dog. No cameras, no attention, no public scrutiny. The more the story spread, the more the officers came under pressure. They had issued their statement, but the questions only kept coming. Their defense, that they acted out of fear for their safety, didn't seem to satisfy the public. People wanted more. They wanted to know why they hadn't taken more time to assess the situation, why they hadn't tried to de-escalate things before resorting to violence. The man's story had struck a chord with many, but now the focus was shifting. It wasn't just about his dog anymore. It was about accountability, about making sure that law enforcement understood the weight of their actions. The legal side of things was slow, and at times it felt like nothing was changing. He spent hours on the phone with his lawyers trying to figure out the best course of action. The officers involved were not going to face criminal charges, but there was still the possibility of a civil suit. It wasn't about money, it never had been, but about making sure that what happened was acknowledged, that it wasn't just brushed aside. The man couldn't bear the thought of it being forgotten, of his dog's life being treated as just another statistic. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed. The weight of the grief, the constant public attention, and the mounting pressure to do something with all of this began to take a toll on him. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, when he lay awake thinking about everything that had led up to this point, wondering if there was more he could have done, if there was a way to have prevented it all. But deep down he knew that this wasn't his fault. He had done what he could. It was the officers who had made the choice, who had decided in that split second that his dog was a threat. They hadn't taken the time to understand, to see things for what they were. But even in the midst of all the noise and the uncertainty, he found moments of clarity. There were still times when he felt his dog's presence with him, even though it was no longer physical. In the stillness of his home, when everything else seemed to fade away, he could almost hear the soft patting of his dog's paws against the floor. He could still remember the way the dog would look up at him, the loyalty in its eyes, the way it would rest its head on his lap after a long day. Those memories were what kept him going, and so he kept moving forward. Each day he faced the legal battles, the media attention, and the public scrutiny with a determination he hadn't known he had. He wasn't going to let his dog's memory fade away. He wasn't going to let the officers involved get off without understanding the full impact of their actions. There were days when it felt like progress was being made, and then there were days when it felt like it was all slipping away. He had moments where he wondered if he was really doing the right thing, if he was just prolonging the pain and the anger. But then he would remember the reason he started this fight in the first place. The dog who had been his companion, his protector, his friend. That was what kept him going. And then, just when it seemed like the case might be dying down, something happened. The officers involved were called to testify in a public hearing. It was a big step, one that he had been hoping for, but it also meant that the situation was about to escalate. The public's interest had peaked again, and this time there was no turning back. The hearing was intense. The man sat in the front row, listening to the officers as they explained their actions. They described the situation as they saw it, how they had felt threatened, how they had made the split-second decision to fire. But as they spoke, the man couldn't help but notice how their words seemed rehearsed, how they were trying to justify something that couldn't be justified. They were trying to make it sound like they had done everything they could, that the situation had been out of their hands. But to the man it was clear. They had acted without thinking, without considering the consequences of their actions. The officers were calm, composed, but the man could see the cracks in their story, the hesitation in their voices, the uncertainty that lingered in the air. And then, as the hearing continued, something unexpected happened. One of the officers, the one who had fired the shot, stood up. The man had been preparing himself for more of the same, more excuses, more justifications. But instead, the officer did something that caught everyone off guard. He apologized. It wasn't much, just a simple statement, but it was enough to shift the course of the hearing. The officer admitted that he had acted out of fear, that he had made a mistake. He said that he regretted what had happened, that he wished things had gone differently. It wasn't a full confession, but it was a start. For a moment, the room was silent. The man sat there, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected an apology. He had expected more resistance, more deflection. But this was different. This was something real. The officer's words didn't bring his dog back, but they did something else. They gave him a sense of closure, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, the officers understood the weight of their actions. They understood the pain they had caused. But the hearing wasn't over yet. The man had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. He stood up, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He spoke about his dog, about the bond they had shared, about the life they had lived together. He spoke about the loss, the grief, and the hole that had been left in his life. And he made it clear, this wasn't just about a dog. It was about respect, about accountability, and about making sure that no one else had to go through what he had experienced. As he finished speaking, the room was still. The officers, the lawyers, and the public all sat in silence, reflecting on the weight of his words. It was a pivotal moment, one that would not soon be forgotten. And though the journey was far from over, the man knew that he had done everything he could. He had fought for justice, for his dog's memory, and for the truth to be heard. And in that moment he knew that no matter what the outcome, he had won. The days after the hearing felt different. The weight of everything that had happened still hung over him, but there was a shift in the air. It wasn't a sense of finality, but more of a quiet resolution, something that had been lacking for so long. He had spoken his truth. He had fought for what was right, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. The media attention didn't die down, though. If anything, it intensified. People were talking. The story had taken on a life of its own, and now it was part of a larger conversation about accountability, respect, and the consequences of quick decisions. The man was becoming a symbol, but it wasn't a role he had ever wanted. He hadn't sought out attention, he had just wanted justice for his dog, but now his voice was being heard, and that felt like both a victory and a burden. He still received messages, some of them kind and supportive, others questioning his motives or criticizing his actions. But it didn't matter anymore. He had gone through the process and he had stood up for what was right. That was enough. He had no control over how people saw him now. All he could do was continue to live his life, to move forward, and to make sure that his dog's memory didn't fade away. The officer's apology had made a difference, but it hadn't brought everything to an end. There was still the matter of the legal case. The civil suit was still in motion, though it had become clear that the officer would not face criminal charges. It was a slow, tedious process, but the man knew that the fight wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that what happened didn't just fade into the background, a forgotten mistake. And as the legal process continued, the man kept pushing forward. Despite everything, life had a way of moving on. He returned to his daily routine, the rhythm of life slowly returning to normal. But there were days when the silence of his home felt heavier. The dog's absence was still there, a constant ache in his chest. He had gotten used to the quiet, but it didn't make it any easier. There were still moments when he would walk into a room, expecting to see his dog lying in its usual spot, and for a brief second, the pain of that loss would hit him all over again. He had tried to fill the emptiness in his life in other ways. He spent more time with the few friends he had left, though he still kept mostly to himself. His past was something that he couldn't share with just anyone, and while some of his friends were understanding, there were always those who just couldn't relate. But the dog had been his companion, and now that it was gone, he was finding new ways to cope with the solitude. He started taking longer walks, venturing into the woods and parks around his neighborhood. He had always enjoyed the solitude of nature, the peace that came from being alone in the quiet. It reminded him of the moments he had spent with his dog, walking together through the fields, the woods, the streets. Even though his dog was gone, those memories still felt alive in the places they used to walk together. But it wasn't just about finding peace. There was still the matter of justice. The man knew that the case wasn't over, that the fight was ongoing. Every step he took, every decision he made felt like a part of that larger battle. He couldn't afford to let go of his fight for accountability, not when so much had been lost. He wasn't just doing this for his dog anymore. He was doing it for everyone who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter, for everyone who had suffered because of quick decisions made by those who had the power to change things. He found that, even in his moments of quiet reflection, the desire for change didn't go away. The legal battles continued to drag on, with motions and counter-motions being filed, delays and more hearings. But slowly there was progress. The officers who had made the mistake were now forced to take a hard look at their actions, and more importantly, the public was watching. The media coverage started to shift as well. It was no longer just about the man and his dog. It had become a story about the larger systemic issues at play. It was about the way law enforcement approached situations, about the quick decisions that could lead to irreversible consequences. The case was becoming a symbol, one that was being used to question how police were trained, how they made decisions, and how those decisions impacted the lives of ordinary people. Though the story was evolving, the man remained focused on his goal. He wasn't trying to change the world all at once, but he knew that if he could make even a small difference, it would be worth it. His dog's death had shaken him, but it had also given him a sense of purpose. He knew that the fight for justice was never easy, and he had come to understand that real change took time. But he was willing to fight for it no matter how long it took. The civil suit eventually made its way to trial. It wasn't the dramatic courtroom battle that some people might have expected, but it was significant nonetheless. The officer who had fired the shot was forced to testify again, this time under oath. The man's legal team presented their case, emphasizing the lack of training and the rushed decision-making that had led to the tragedy. They argued that the officer had not done enough to assess the situation, that he had acted out of fear rather than caution. The officer, for his part, stood firm in his belief that he had acted in self-defense. But as the trial went on, it became clear that the situation could have been handled differently. The jury deliberated for hours before finally returning with their verdict. The officer was found liable for the wrongful death of the dog. It wasn't the same as bringing the dog back, of course. The man knew that nothing would ever fill the hole that had been left in his life, but it was a victory nonetheless. The case had become a turning point, one that would likely lead to changes in how situations like this were handled in the future. And for the man, that was enough. The settlement that followed the verdict wasn't as important to him as the symbolic victory. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about what he could get in return for his loss. It was about the message. It was about making sure that people understood the consequences of their actions, that they understood that mistakes had real-life consequences. And as he left the courtroom that day, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't known he needed. Life didn't go back to normal. It never could. But it did go forward. The man found a new sense of peace, not because everything was right, but because he had done what he could. He had fought for his dog's memory, and in doing so, he had fought for something bigger than himself. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. In the weeks and months that followed, the man continued to walk those familiar paths. He would never forget the bond he had shared with his dog, and while that bond was no longer physical, it lived on in his heart. The world had changed, and so had he, but the memory of his dog would stay with him forever, a reminder of loyalty, love, and the power of standing up for what was right.